What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we are going to be going over even more advanced hitbox techniques. So specifically we're going to be going over how to modify the direction of launch based on the way the enemy is facing, so the attacker is facing. And we're also going to be going over modifiers, launch modifiers and damage modifiers, so we can actually start using them more in the future. In today's episode, we're really only going to set up this logic and allow the modifiers to factor into the overall launch and damage. But very shortly in the future, we will be going over actual formulas we can use to create different effects when we want to launch the opponent or deal more damage. So let's get into it. You can see I am the character tagged Shawnthebro. I'm using the yellow default character here, and we're going to test out some logic. So in the previous episode, we covered how we could have damage occur and force the character to be launched in a given direction based on the way they were facing. Now we want to cover it based on the direction the attacker is facing. So for example, if I attack my opponent, I should launch them to the right. Now, it doesn't matter what direction this default character is facing, right? If I attack them, they should still launch to the right. Whether they're facing left or right, it doesn't matter. That was not happening before. It was based off the character being hit. It was based off their direction, not the attacker's direction. So now you can see we can base it off of the direction the character that is causing the hitbox to spawn and attacking the enemy, and we can launch the opponent in that given direction. We can also determine whether we want this to be the case, if we want there to be an instigator or an owner of the hitbox, which will determine the direction that the character is launched when attacked. Alright, so let's hop into it today. Before we get started, we're going to take a look at this iCard right here in the top right corner. This is the playlist for the Super Smash Brothers / Platform Fighter tutorial series. So if you'd like to get caught up, you can check that out and see everything we've done to date. Alternatively, I'll leave this iCard right here, which is the previous episode where we went over the different things we could do with launch and hitboxes in our game. Otherwise, we'll get started in the code today, so we can go to our SSB template character as a starting point, and we can scroll down to our take damage function. Now, our take damage function had a bunch of improvements in the last episode. We had damage, horizontal launch amount, vertical launch amount, the hit location of the actual hitbox, and if the launch should match the character direction or not. I've added a new one now that I'm calling the instigator. So this is an actor pointer. Basically, it's going to be the owner or the creator of the hitbox that is causing take damage here. Now, hitboxes can come from many things. They can come from weapons and items themselves. They could come from assist trophies or, teammates. They could come from the actual characters like they are in this case, and that's the most basic case. But by making an actor, we can encompass all of these types and change what happens depending on the type of actor that it is. So actor is a solid and safe type to use because we can do a lot more with it than just based on if it's a certain character class or, a different enemy in the game. It could also be other things, like I said, stage hazards or, items themselves, different things like that. I'm calling it instigator, but you call it hitbox owner or hitbox creator or whatever you want, really. I just like the term instigator because we will be using this term quite a bit when we're dealing with, who did what action, so we can relate back to that character. I do default it to null pointer, meaning we don't have to pass one in. If we don't pass one in, our logic is going to be different. Not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's actually intended in this case. If we don't have an instigator, we know that we don't have an owner that we want to attribute the damage to. So we could potentially call this like a self-inflicted damage or perhaps a stage hazard or something like that. And we can do different logic based off of that as well. One thing to note, when you do default values on variables like we've done with our hit location, where we passed in a default F vector, our boolean where we passed in true, and now this actor where we pass in null pointer, the default values should appear at the end of the function. Otherwise, you will often get errors because that is how C++ expects you to put your default parameters. They expect them all at the end in a list. Okay. Now if we go into our SSB template character and scroll down to the take damage function, make sure that you add this actor pointer, instigator. Again, you don't have to put null pointer or your default parameter here because it doesn't matter in this case. As long as the header file has it, the function knows that it has a default value. And now in take damage, we have even more logic than we did before. So this is going to cover basically all of our main ways of dealing damage or handling damage between two characters, as well as set up the future logic for what happens for self-inflicted damage, stage hazards, and differences in item and weapon damage. Alright, so we have our standard damage logic, which is literally just handling the damage counter and what the value should be. And then we had this check where we're looking at our boolean should launch match character direction and determining if we should launch the character in the direction that they were facing. Now, in the previous episode, again, we only cared about the direction the character that was being launched was facing. So we were basically always sending them in the opposite direction they were facing. And I think of this as like older Castlevania style games. You take damage on something like spikes on the ground and it launches the character backward. It gets them out of the hazard, but it also launches them and prevents their progress. Although it's not the exact same scenario here, that's what I like to think of for that type of thing. However, we also have this other scenario, and this is probably the most common way to take damage, is when an enemy attacks this character, and they should be launched in the direction that the enemy is facing. That is why we need this instigator. We won't always have that, so we also have to handle cases where we don't have an instigator. So let's go through this line by line. We still have this check to see if we should launch the direction that the character is facing. If we do want to launch them this way, then we have to check to see if they have an instigator. So if there is an instigator, basically if this is not null pointer, this will have a value that we assign to it later on in the episode. If it's not invalid, and you can see if there is an owner creator of this hitbox, stage hazards, self-inflicted damage, and other special circumstances may not have an owner creator. So if that's the case, we're going to go into the else. But for all of our standard attacks where one character hits another, there should be an instigator. And so we're going to use that to launch the character in the proper direction. The next thing we have to do, if there is an instigator, is determine if it's the proper type. Now we're in our base character fighter here. So we have our SSB template character or our SSB fighter here. All right. But we could also have something like I mentioned earlier, like an assist trophy or an assist character, where there is a character that spawns a hitbox and does it, but it's not the SSB template character. It's its own class. If that's the case, our logic is going to vary slightly. So I'm actually covering that sort of logic now by checking to see if it is an SSB template character. And if it is, we're going to do this logic. I don't have an else at the moment, but here we could easily add one to update the logic we want to occur if it is not of this type. So as this comment says, if the owner creator of this hitbox is a playable character, not assist character, item character, etc. Now, this if statement is basically taking the instigator actor that came in to the function. It's casting it to this type. If it is not that type, then it will fail and we won't be able to go into this if statement. If it is this type, then it should succeed and we can then use the parameters and the variables of the owning character here. Okay, so essentially I'm making a pointer of this type and setting it to the result of this cast. If this succeeds, we're going to go into the function and we're going to do this logic here. This logic is very simple. Basically what we're doing is we're checking if the owning character is facing right, and if they are, we're calling our handle launch function, which we've set up in previous episodes of the series. And it's going to launch this character in that direction. This is important because it doesn't matter what direction the launched character is facing. It only matters what direction the owning character of the hitbox is facing. If they're facing right, we want to launch the opponent to the right, which usually is a negative value in Unreal by default. If you look in, for example, here, and we click on, let's say, the base player controller, which is in the top left. The location is 929 on the Y. Now let's look at the base player controller that is on the bottom right. And you can see the location on the Y is negative 1330. So going to the right is usually negative by default in Unreal. Thus, if the owning character is launching the attacked character to the right, we want to send them a negative value for the horizontal. Vertical is still up in this case, so we're leaving that alone. Else, that means they're facing to the left. We're launching them to the left, which means we pass our default horizontal launch amount. Now, else, if there is no instigator, we do the standard logic here that we were doing in the previous episode, which is just based off of the way this character is facing. Notice that this is the else of if should launch match character direction is true. So if this is true, but there is no instigator, we then go into the logic from the previous episode. We only take is facing right from the launched character. But else, if this boolean is false, we go into this logic here, which is where we determine the actual hit location. So this could be for projectiles, like homing projectiles. If they flip around and get on the other side of the character, we don't care what direction either of the characters are facing. We only care where the hit occurred. That way we know what direction to launch the character. So now we have all of our bases covered. We have all these different techniques we can use to launch the character in the given direction. With that done, however, we need a way to pass in the proper instigator. That way we know who is going to be launching the character and in what direction. So if we go into Unreal, there's a few things we're going to do. The first thing I'd recommend doing is going into your base game of BP. If you've been following the series, we have this random item spawner, and I put it on an arbitrary delay for now because we don't have an item manager yet. And it was 1 second before. That was way too short. We were actually spawning weapons all the time. It was very difficult for me to test certain mechanics. I've set the delay to 5 seconds. That way it takes 5 seconds between weapon spawns. This gives us a lot more freedom when we're actually playing the game and testing it. That way we don't have weapons spawning constantly. And now let's go into our default anim BP. Now, the animation blueprint is where we spawn the hitboxes. We have a function called create active hitbox. And once these anim notifies go on each attack, say our basic attack here, spawns an anim notify at certain parts of the animation to create a hitbox and destroy a hitbox. When that occurs, we call create active hitbox and pass in the data of that animation and the hitbox that should spawn with it. So with that in mind, what we were doing is passing in our variables and then setting all of our values as needed, then spawning the hitbox. Well, that works, but there's something that we need to do here to actually be able to set an instigator. So our hitbox after BP is spawned in create active hitbox, and we set the owner of the animation blueprint as the owner of the hitbox. For now, this is right for all instances. For assists and different items that can create weapons on their own, you may want to change this. You don't have to, because the character can be the owner of all of those things as well. But you'll see more of this kind of logic down the line. For now, this is fine, but keep this in mind because this is where we set the owner. Now, if you go into the hitbox after BP itself, we call take damage at the end of the check collision function. This is something we set up in the past. We call this function and we pass in different variables. For you probably only see hitbox damage, horizontal, vertical launch amounts, get actor location, and should launch match character direction. So you don't have everything I have here. Don't worry, we will be covering all that in today's episode. The main thing for right now is that we have to pass in something to the instigator in this case. So the instigator of the standard hitbox, right here from check collision, is the owner of the hitbox. And as I said, that was set in the animation blueprint here. So it's going to be the character that spawned this hitbox as the owner. So the way you do this is you can either drag off the instigator section and take damage, or literally type get owner. You want the owner of the actor, and you drag the return value in the instigator. It's that simple. So that's everything that you'll need to know for the owner, for instigators of hitboxes, and all that other good stuff. The other thing we're covering today are these launch and damage multipliers, which we set up a while ago in the hitboxes, but we haven't really used yet. We're going to overhaul our charge time system to use these variables instead. It's not really important the values or the formulas that we're using today. It's just important that we're using these variables correctly. That way when we want to change these in the future based off of formulas or charge times or damage amounts, that it's very, very simple to do. So all we have to do here is this. In our hitbox actor CPP and .h, we have these damage multipliers, launch multipliers. Now, I added these a long time ago. If you haven't added them, you can feel free to add them now. But basically, these are additional multipliers that can be applied to the damage and the launch based off of whatever factors we want, really. If it's a hitbox, we might want to change the launch amount. If you attack with a, if you hit a certain hurtbox on the character first, you might want to increase the damage amount that is done. We could do it based only on the charge time of the attack. We could do it based on if the character's in a certain state. For example, if they're in a sleep state from an item and they get attacked, we want to increase their damage. Your freedom is limitless here. So if you have these variables, all we're going to do is multiply all of our values that require these multipliers before passing it in to take damage. Alternatively, in the take damage function, you could also pass in these multipliers and determine the logic you want to do with them. That is up to you. I kind of liked passing them into the damage, horizontal launch, and vertical launch of the take damage. That way when the take damage function was being used, I had the total launch amount, total damage amount that would be used. I didn't have to worry about any sort of multipliers in here. All right. And now what we're doing is, again, we're going to pass these in right here. So what I've done is I've taken my hitbox damage, for example, and I've done float times float right here, and I've passed in my damage multiplier. Then I've used that in my damage for my take damage function. For the horizontal launch amount and vertical launch amount, I've done the same thing where I have this float times float, but I've used the launch multiplier for each, the horizontal and vertical. You could have separate launch multipliers for vertical and horizontal. I did not. And so now this is what my take damage looks like. Now we also need to set these values so that they have something, they're not just 0. You could default them to 1.0 if you'd like. In the hitbox actor CPP, I've actually done this. That way I don't have to worry about it being 0. Think about this. If you multiply your damage by 0, you're going to get 0 damage. So this multiplier would actually hurt you. We want these multipliers to be values that either lessen or greaten the damage or the launch that is received, not necessarily nullify it, or at least not nullify it by default. So I set them to 1.0 in the constructor, and you may already have that. That's just a refresher. But now I'm going to show you a very simple way we can actually set these in our NMVP and create active hitbox, instead of just setting everything in the damage and the launches itself like we were doing in previous episodes. So let's go into the create active hitbox function and let's take a look at something. Here we were passing in a charge time, and as you can see, it was going into this node here, float plus float. It was actually taking the damage and adding the charge time to it and just setting the hitbox damage to that. That was just an arbitrary thing I did. I actually don't want to do that anymore. I want the hitbox damage to be based only on the damage that comes into here. We will then modify the damage multiplier later on in the function, and we'll do the math at the end. This is particularly important because you could have multiple factors going in, multiple multipliers, multiple different sources of damage, and you want to make sure that everything is tracked independently so that we can access them as we need them. So I'm actually going to get rid of this float plus float, and I'm only going to use my damage here as my hitbox damage. Okay. So hitbox damage comes directly from the damage node. Now the charge time also was going into the launch. If you take a look at this, the horizontal launch amount, charge time was actually factoring into that as well from previous episodes. Basically, I brought charge time into a float times float node, multiplied it by 15, and then added it to the horizontal launch amount, as you can see here. Okay, and then I took that result and set it to the horizontal launch amount of the hitbox. Well, again, we don't want the charge time to factor directly into this anymore. We want it to factor into the launch multiplier. So I'm actually going to get rid of these two nodes here. I'm going to take, this is my horizontal launch amount right here. I'm going to then bring this back over to where it was, plug it back into this reroute node, and then this reroute node is going to go into the horizontal launch amount. Just like that. So now the charge time does not factor in at all to the horizontal launch amount or the hitbox damage. You can see that the charge time is now no longer needed. It's not being used, and that's actually what I want. I want to remove the charge time from this function. Don't worry, that doesn't mean that the charge time is not going to be used. It is. However, right now we only have one charge time. We were passing it directly in to the create active hitbox, even though it was always the same value. We were just grabbing the charge time from our character reference. So instead of passing it into all your hitboxes, you can delete it and not have it in these create active hitboxes. Okay? Now go directly into the create active hitbox function. You can see I do have some errors like this. Make sure you clean up all of these functions that have these until your NMBP is back to normal. Go into here, and we're going to use the charge time independently. That way we can set up the variables that we need here. So I'm going to do this actually in a way that is a little bit easier for you guys to see. And that's like this. So at the end of my function, okay, we went through, we set all of our variables, and we set our Boolean that we made in the previous episode. We would normally spawn our hitbox once all the variables were set and add it to the list of active hitboxes. Before we do that, I want to set these two other variables that we weren't using before, our damage multiplier and our launch multiplier. So simply drag off of your hitbox actor BP object reference like you've done with the rest of your variables, and set your damage multiplier and set your launch multiplier. Get both of these, and then we need the data to pass into it. What we're going to pass in are arbitrary values for now, essentially. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm taking the character reference, getting the charge time variable from it. The way you do that is we have our character reference, we have our charge time, and now all I'm doing is I'm actually doing a clamp on a float, and I'm passing in a 1 and a 2. This is because we're going to be setting a multiplier. For now, I want the minimum to be 1, meaning that the multiplier will be 1.0. So even if we don't charge this attack at all, it's not decreasing our damage. It's just not increasing it any farther. If it was 0, remember, it would cancel out and would have no damage, no launch. So I'm clamping the value between 1 and 2. It's up to you what you do with these values for now. And again, we're going to do a lot of actually very complex formulas to figure out all the damage and the launch amounts that we want, including launch angles and other physics like that. However, we're not to that yet, so let's just set our variables. Again, I have 1 and 2 because I don't want it too crazy. If I let this charge time go to like 13 and I use that as the actual multiplier, then I will multiply my damage and my launch by 13. Which can be insane. It can be basically a one-hit kill for even relatively small amounts of damage. Then I just pass these in. So this happens to be my damage, this happens to be my launch, but right now they are the same amounts, same multiplier values. Now you probably already did this, but you can see that I'm multiplying them now. So if I have a horizontal launch amount of say 5 units, okay, but my launch multiplier is 2. Then I take 5 units, multiply it by 2, and my new horizontal launch amount is 10. Same with the vertical launch amount. Now damage is the same way as well. Say I do 15 damage on my standard attack, but I've charged up my charge time is 2 in this case. We hit the maximum, so 2 seconds I've held this attack. Then we do 15 times 2, and we do 30 damage. So now we've gotten rid of all these extra dependencies that we don't need inside this function, and instead what we've done is we've created these multipliers that we can freely mess around with and add things to based on, you know, resistances, blocking. You could have chip damage, you could have, you know, super armor, you could have all sorts of different things that can affect these multipliers. And that's the really important fact, is these multipliers should be separate from the actual damage and launches themselves. We don't want them to interact like they were before. That was good for an example standpoint, but it wasn't good for an actual logic standpoint like we're going to need in the future. So now with that done, we can go into our game and we can take a look at the damage that we are actually doing. So let's say, set up our character. Okay, we can even go here because we don't have to send the character off the edge, all right? So let's say we start up the game here, and let's go and attack our opponent. I do 8 damage by default without having very little charge time, most likely because my charge time modifier was 0, but with the clamp that we have in here, it defaults to 1, so a multiplier of 1 on the damage is going to be 8 times 1, which is 1, because my standard attack does 8 damage. I can also hold my attack. If I hold it for longer than 2 seconds or 2 seconds, then it's going to do 16 damage because that is 8 times 2. And the same goes for the launch. So the launch itself, I haven't modified, but it does have a little bit of an equation in there now. So it actually takes into account the damage counter. So there's a little bit that's going to alter every time with the damage. But if we take a look at the launch itself, if I do a standard attack, you can see I launch the character this direction. This is my standard attack. You can see I've launched them back to, you know, a few feet from the edge. If I go back to the same point, you can see it launches them closer to the edge. If I go back to the same point, almost over the edge, and over the edge, okay? But if I hold and charge, they're going to go 2 times, which is exceptionally farther. And anyway, guys, that's pretty much it for today's episode. So this is how you can use multipliers and modifiers in our game. We'll be doing a ton with these in the future, but we had to make sure that the logic was set up properly the first time around. So now you can have fun playing around with your different launch and damage values, as well as launching the character in the right direction, regardless of the way they are facing. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do. I really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for everything you do. I'm really grateful. It really encourages me to keep working on these series, and thank you so much for all the love and support you've given me. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to assist you. It's completely free. There's a link in the description on how to join. And anyway, guys, like I said, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.